Welcome to the NAACAM and BDO podcast. My name is Nduduzo Chala. I am the NAACAM COO and I have the privilege of being the moderator of this third series of the podcast that we have been doing with BDO. Joining me is a fresh and colleagues in the industry who are well versed with the topic that we are going to be covering today, which talks on localization, driving local excellence, and how local sourcing can fuel South Africa's economic engine. Joining me, Amith Singh, who is the National Manufacturing Manager from Nedbank. Thank you for joining us today. We've got Buhle Hanise, who is the National Head Business Restructuring here at BDO. And lastly, we've got Sentle Mokalanyane, who is the Head of Corporate Planning and Strategy at the AITF, so a key partner of the industry, which is the Automotive Industry Transformation Fund. So welcome, guests, and I think thank you for joining this third iteration again. As I noted, we'll be covering a question which is intricate and critical for the industry, which is localization and how we drive that forward to ensure that there's sustainability in the industry, that we create what I think the SAM Automotive Master Plan 2035 has in terms of its pillars. One is localization and how we drive that forward as industry players. And I think with your wealth of knowledge and experience, I think it's going to be a fruitful session that we're going to have today. But probably just as a detour to us coming to that conversation, we recently had the NAACAM show, which is the fourth iteration that we've done as NAACAM. NAACAM, I think, as you would understand, represents the component manufacturers, and it is a tool for us to showcase the excellence and the breadth of component manufacturing under the autos banner in the South African automotive sector. 13th, 14th of August was when we had it. I think it was the first time also that we went to Gqeberha. We were kindly hosted by the Boardwalk Convention Center. We had key leaders, including, I think, the Premier Oscar Mabuyane, who blessed us. I think we had the ministers, Stella Ndabeni of small business. We had our line as autos, trade and industry, Minister Mpho Pakstau. We also had the Minister of Labor, Makosazana Amith. And then lastly, I think on the second day, Deputy President Paul Mashatile also came, and I think they all emphasized the sustainability, competitiveness, and inclusive growth that we required in the industry to ensure that we scaled up. I'm going to turn to probably two of my colleagues who I think were part of the NAACAM show experience and I think the iteration of this year, just to get probably some insights and takeouts on how you felt and probably some of the feedback. I mean, I think we did have 56 speakers on the 2 days over the conference. We had 160 brands who had exhibition stands who were part of that 2,500 total attendees. I think it was one of the biggest NAACAM shows that I think we put together. But I think I can clap for myself as NAACAM, but I think I would need your colleagues to then say, actually, how do you feel about it? Amith, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, thanks for having me here today. I think back on the NAACAM show, you made mention that it was a showcase, of what component manufacturers have to offer and have to do. And I agree with that sentiment. I think in a practical space, that's something you could visually see. Something I want to allude to, if people haven't attended and weren't at the show, is the intangible, the untangible stuff. What did it feel like to be there? What did it feel like to hear the buzz and to feel the buzz on the floor? And I think that for me was probably the most impressive thing. There's absolutely no secret that the sector has been facing tremendous headwinds. Anything from, we were greeted with a New Year's letter from ArcelorMittal, the Trump administration, tariffs, there's been a lot of headwinds that the sector is facing. But what the NAACAM show gave me is a sense of hope, is a sense of belief, is a sense of grit. The fears that our South African component manufacturers have, again, under the stewardship of NAACAM, was absolutely astounding. So as much as the tangible stuff was clearly, there for everyone to see, and we can probably look at any video and see what a resounding success that was. Uh, but I think it's the intangible is for what it felt like, some of these conversations, the optimism that people were sharing at that NARCAM show. And I think that's the gift of the NARCAM show, is that it's hosted by the association for its members, its constituents, and to take it all the way out to Eastern Cape. I stand to be corrected. That's probably one of the biggest events, that's ever been showcased there. So it's good to see it. People say that that area or that region is the Detroit of South Africa. I'd rather not use Detroit as an example. Let's stay away from there. Let's keep our roots. That's our auto sector in South Africa. So I think well done. Earlier on you can't clap for yourself, but we definitely did clap for yourselves at NARCAM for the astounding show that you guys put together.
No, fantastic. And I think with what I think you mentioned, one of the biggest shows, Eastern Cape, is the hub. I think also of we've got some main OEMs who are based in the Eastern Cape. So I think we've done two in Durban, we've done one in Gauteng. So I think we needed to also showcase some of the excellence, and I think the component manufacturers certainly showed up. Sentle, let's come to you as well. I think noting also that I think to both of you is that Nedbank was also a gold sponsor, so I think we were appreciative of that. And then the AITF was a platinum sponsor for us, so I think it was a key partner. And having you, I think, made a lot of sense for us in driving the transformation. What are your thoughts on the NAACAM show?
Yeah, I mean, I think to echo the words of Amith, our view is also that the NAACAM show is a resounding success. You've mentioned some of the stats around, the attendance at the show. I think this year's show, given the context of the environment that we're headwinds in the operating environment, trade uncertainty, and so on. There was certainly an air of intent around this year's LACAM show. The exhibition floor was buzzing, and I think one of the things that perhaps you hadn't mentioned is around the formalized business-to-business meetings that were facilitated. You really got a sense that this was not one of those talk shops events, and that often occur. In addition to that, I think it was a strong platform to have frank discussions between government, industry, and labor around the state of the industry, as well as the future. What are the practical things that are going to move this sector forward? What are the things that are needed for resilience, and also how do we prepare for future changes in technology and then other events that might not occur. As AITF, you rightly mentioned, we were a sponsor of the NAACAM show. That allowed us to bring along some of our beneficiaries on the floor, who had provided very strong feedback about just the experience at the show, and of course it promotes and emphasizes the support that we want to have to the component manufacturing sector through initiatives such as the NAACAM show. So yeah, it was really a good success past.
I mean, I think you mentioned the B2B meetings. I think what we've sort of understood, and in terms of analysis, there was about 715 B2B meetings that took place over. And I think it was probably 2 days which was filled with conversations. There were certain statements, as I noted earlier, of saying how do we inclusively grow and how do we then take the industry forward, which I think mattered for us. And I think BDO was one of our partners, and hence I think we are doing these series of podcasts. I think was to also showcase that piece, to say as a NACA member and also a partner in the industry. It's not necessarily that it's only going to be component manufacturers who have to change the landscape of how we progress in autos. I think maybe we'll say, to cover that piece of saying, I think we only generally say, I mean, I think it is our bid and and butter. To say we look out for policy trade elements for our component manufacturers. But I think the partnerships we have with associates, the partnerships we have with the other sectors who are also building are quite critical for us. And I think you are one of those partners as BDO. Maybe touch on some of those elements on the partnering to then further success the industry and push the industry to its strength.
Yeah. Look, as BDO, we were very proud to have been one of your partners on the show. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it as I was not well that week, but I did get feedback from Sia, who's our head of auto at BDO in Tabeja in the Eastern Cape. And I am from Mthatha in the Eastern Cape. So I was looking forward to it. And I'm glad you guys went to the Eastern Cape this year. And I hope you will go back next year and I'll get an opportunity to attend. But I think probably for BDO and especially for CM Tembo, who's our head of auto, why it was critical for me to even form part of this panel was because of my previous opportunities where I was employed before. I was CFO of Beijing Automobile SA, that's also in Gqeberha for a couple of years. And I was seconded there by the IDC at first, and they did employ me full time. So I was at the IDC previously in a workout and restructuring division. I was the team leader of the business rescue sector. And I ended up going to bike because my biggest portfolio at the time was auto. And most of my clients were those component manufacturers you guys saw at the show. And some of them, unfortunately, we were unable to save. They obviously struggled from recession in 2008, exit of General Motors. Now, with the current sort of recession that we're in, and also obviously, and I'm sure even today, a lot of the component manufacturers are struggling with the tariffs that are coming in. So we're very intentional as BDO to partner with initiatives like what you guys did at the show to give our component manufacturers an opportunity to showcase themselves, to be able to not come into my space as the national head of restructuring because they are distressed, but rather to help them to become partners. So what I usually tell my team to say when we're selling ourselves to businesses is that you don't need to necessarily be in a distressed environment to bring me in. You must just ask for that helping hand, an extension of the team. Because with all these changes and navigating all these industry impacts, whether it's localization issues, it's industry policies or government policies, you do need that partner. So as BDO overall, we wanted to just showcase ourselves as well, to say we're here to lend that helping hand in this very important economic industry. As an Eastern Cape person, I know very well how many of my family members work for Mercedes-Benz, work for VW, work for Beijing Automobile, work for the new ones that have come in, the Stellantis, all of those people. So those individuals for us are the ones that are creating this economic hub that we have in the auto sector, and we want them to retain their jobs. So it's not just about the fluffiness of just partnering. We just want to see the BDO brand, as part and parcel of the sponsorship. We're very intentional because we want to make sure that the economic growth of this country is maintained and actually does grow if we can.
No, fantastic, and I think how you showed up. In fact, I think all of you as our partners certainly shows that commitment that I think one you have to autos. I think the partners in OEMs as well. I mean, I think what you tend to find is the OEMs come and like yourselves as the AITF come with the beneficiaries or their suppliers to the show, so that I think it can also add to that breadth of excellence of what gets manufacturing and where the value add sits in the automotive context. And I mean, I think we saw that BMW, I think, played a big part. Toyota, South Africa also played a big part. Isuzu, we saw, I think, also Mercedes-Benz. So there was great support, not just only on the component players, but also from the OEMs. And the conversation that is required. And maybe this is probably just a high level, Amith, to say, how do we get to that piece, right, of components being integrated into OEMs? And I think there is an example, as I've said, of saying they were part of it and they came with their beneficiaries. What does that signify? I think you spoke about hope, but what would you think it signifies to have that changed in an OEM who is, let's say, your customer, but also looking at the value chain of autos?
Um, I don't necessarily think there's a silver bullet, you know. I think at the outset, we need to understand the total value chain of autos. And quite often, I think we look at autos in its different component. Well, let me not use the word components, but you look at it in the different segments as opposed to the holistic value chain. So I think the moment you understand the holistic value chain, what does it comprise of? Firstly, on the local content, and also understand the fact that autos is a global market. You know, your vehicle that is ideally, you know, I always joke about this fact is that when people are driving the VW Polo Boy, it's a German engineered vehicle. Yeah, sure, but it's built here. You know, let's not forget that we've got the expertise here. It doesn't mean that we're sourcing everything from here. You know, there could be components coming from Turkey, etc., etc., etc. So, I think one is to understand what does that entire local value chain look like, what does that global value chain look like, and how do we create inclusivity that's to the benefit of our own country. Often is the case is that when the OEMs are not directly involved, or we're not taking the guidance from the OEMs or listen to that, we can very quickly lose our market. When I say we, I mean both public sector and private sector. You know, if we look back at Australia, they almost lost their entire auto sector, you know, because of poor policy, poor decisions that were being made, and we had quite a pivotal crossroad here with all the headwinds that we face and all the challenges that we face in. Could this be an opportunity where we start promoting local content? Could this be an opportunity where we start promoting localization? You know, I use the example of load shedding and the Prince of Darkness at ESCOM when that greeted us at Stage 6 a couple of years ago. Had it not been for load shedding, which was a really dark time for us as a country, we would have probably not adopted alternative energy as aggressively as we were or as we have. So, you know, in the midst of load shedding, there were solar panels and batteries going in left, right, and center. And we took off pressure from the grid and we made things work. I'm saying now, with the headwinds that we find in now, with tariffs, with ArcelorMittal, how do we take what is in essence not the best story, but how do we change that narrative? How do we frame that differently together with the OEMs, together with the value chain that services that the downstream operations? Because both downstream and upstream needs to be, you know, valued in the same content. If you're a tier 3 supplier, what is your linkages to the OEM? How does an OEM enable that? And are we having those conversations? Is government incentivizing, promoting that? Because without understanding that entire value chain, we're not going to know which levers to pull. And I think again, you know, as my colleagues here made mention, everyone has a part to play in it. You know, it could be through the consultancy of a BDO, could be through the insights or the linkages created by the AITF. It could be through the funding that we potentially create. It could be the guidance and policy influence that NAACAM holds. But I think it's gone with the days where any one of us as individuals can promote our individual companies as going at it alone. We need to understand that this partnering approach for the sector is critical to its longevity, to its sustainability, and to its survival, you know, for the foreseeable future. I firmly believe that, you know, we've done relatively well in autos. If you have a look at some of the other sectors that have really, really struggled, we've done really well at autos, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we must sit back and hope that it'll change. I think hope is meant for when we go to our place of prayer. I think it's now time for action. And how do we, I mean, you know, Sentle and I were talking about it earlier on. How do we put something tangible? What is tangible? Let's stop those talk shops and, you know, let's not talk localization. Let's do localization.
Let's zoom in on that piece. And I think I like that you're already on that localization piece. And one of the messaging, or let's say the key proponents that came out was to say we need more, or we need to deepen localization. When you look at the automotive master plan, one of the pillars is transformation, to say how do we transform the sector to ensure that there are more people who partake who are of South African origin, and we expand the base, if you consider tier 1, tier 2s, and your tier 3s who supply into these OEMs. We've got targets that we've put in place in terms of the number of employees as an ambition to say, I mean, currently I think we're sitting at about 112, 113,000 employees in autos. 82,000 of those sit in the component space. And I think when we talk tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, we need to expand that base so that we can see much more of that. So Automotive Master Plan 25 talk about target. It talks about localization at 60% in year 2035. And I think one, as we said, I mean, it came into play in 2021. And when we look at that, I think we can start to say, and the Haywinds you talk about, to say, where are we? When we were to say, where are we as a sector when it comes to some of the targets that we had placed for ourselves, where do you think you'd say a sentiment?
The last sort of decade in the auto industry has been characterized by a lot of headwinds. Over the last 5 years, we've experienced the impact of COVID, and then also impacts on supply chains and chits and so on that affected the automotive sector. So I think in the context of the global automotive market, there's been shocks to the system which go further than what the South African sector is dealing with. Linked to that, I think Amith made the point around global sourcing practices, where our component manufacturers and factory suppliers within South Africa are not only just competing with local players, but you're competing on a global scale for volumes within the production environment. So I think for the South African auto sector, it's critical to be able to deepen and widen contribution at a tier 2 and tier 3 level to ensure that Black-owned and SME companies are able to participate meaningfully within the sector. It is critical that there's coordinated and deliberate interventions that we develop that speak to mentoring, speak to skills development, speaks to funding, and all of these things in a package operating within an enabling policy environment to be able to catalyze movement in the sector. From an AITF perspective, what we do to support businesses in the sector, I mean, we do provide funding, developmental funding through a variety of instruments, provide what we call business support, which is sort of grant support to help competitiveness of businesses that are in the sector, because you understand that the competition is paramount. Companies are not going to just source from South African or local companies for the sake of posterity. That there needs to be a proper value that they're getting out of sourcing locally. But I think more importantly, linked to that, we provide what we call market access, which is linkages for opportunities. So we ensure that there's sustainability from companies that we're supporting. Recently, we've also taken over responsibility for administering ASCII, which is the Automotive Supply Chain Competitiveness Initiative, which is a partnership between industry and government to look at opportunities for technological improvements, process improvements within the production base, just to also put companies that are trying to participate in the sector on a good footing. And we're looking for more of these opportunities for sector collaboration to make sure that we can raise the profile of on the sector.
I mean, maybe let me come to you. I think the first panel, the NAACAM president, Ugo, took us through, I think, what are the challenges that autos had. I think that panel was very robust panel. I mean, I think the GS General Secretary, Evan Jim of NUMSA, was on that panel. So some of the sentiments that you bring to say it's no longer time to talk, we need to now implement, I think was quite critical for him. But what the president made mention of is to say, when we consider the automotive master plan, by 2025, we should have been at 48% of local content. But when we consider where we are at the moment, we're still skirting at the 38%, which is, I think from a target perspective, we're 10% away. So why is this localization important to drive the South African the South African automotive manufacturing base or autos? What would be your sentiments on that to say why is it a critical driver?
It's important for us to be critical on it mitigates risk. I think let's start there. I'm a banker, so risk is an important thing for us. But it mitigates risk. I mean, I think if we take some lessons of the recent Trump administration, what's happening there, Russia and Ukraine, all these happenings that are happening on the global landscape that are affecting us. A large part of it is creating unserious in our auto sector. So by localization, we have the opportunity to mitigate the risk of reliance on other countries and other parties. I think it also allows us a certain form of autonomy within our country. And as we've seen, a lot of the auto sector is going in the custom route, the more tailored route. With autonomy, you have that opportunity to do that. Our lead and lag times then subsequently become shorter, which ultimately then is benefiting the end user, the consumer. We understand that cost could be quite conflicting because certain of our global partners, which was Sentle made reference to earlier, it's a very competitive market. But at scale, we can make it profitable here, and the overall benefit still, will outweigh the cost factor locally. And what does it all necessarily mean? Is that creating jobs, creating employment, less reliance on government to pay out grants, to pay out, fundings, and all of those, extra pressure on government. The creation of jobs subsequently ultimately delivers on our GDP. It improves our overall market, our overall sector. So, the improvement of localization on autos is not necessarily just an autos conversation. I think it's an overall conversation on the beneficiaries of South Africa as a country as a whole. I think, there's something we don't necessarily consider all the time. We look at our global competition, but at the back end of it, South Africa has always been the gateway to Africa from an autos perspective, or for many trade perspectives for that, right? And our slow adoption, and you said, we kind of teetering on that 38%, we're quite far behind of where we should be. It's no longer even a case of that now we're only fighting people overseas or competitors overseas. We're now fighting our brothers and sisters, of north of Africa. That's who we're fighting for market share. They are ramping up while we are quite stagnant. If we don't ramp up and do something quite aggressively to promote, localization, to promote local manufacturing, the use of local product, and I think this is throughout the value chain from OEM all the way down to tier 3, is we very soon going to lose that key to being the gateway to Africa. Let's face it, geologically or geographically rather, we're not very well poised. We're on the southern tip of Africa. Our exported trade partners are all further north. We've got challenges with port, rail, infrastructure. I can name all these challenges, which was part of the panel discussion. So folks, let's understand the challenges. We've improved in many regards. I think 2 months ago, our ports performed the best it has in the last 5 years. Rain's, coming back online and back on track again. So there are some positives that are taken out of this. How do we leverage that and accelerate that to rightfully own our space? We can't be the poor cousins anymore as a country. How do we work together in improving the sector and looking at it more large scale as opposed to this is only autos? It's only a small part of our GDP. It's only a small employer compared to the larger scale of things. The multiplier effect is phenomenal. And I think what saddens me, and apologies for using quite an emotive statement by saying, but what saddens me is that we've got the skills, we've got the expertise, we've got the ability. How do we get policy that supports this? How do we get the OEMs to aggressively drive this and ramp up the pace of this before it's too late? I think the last thing we want to see, and I'll end on this point, the last part we want to see is have localization and transformation happen aggressively and forced upon the sector. So we've seen it in other subsectors, and I'm going to use an example. We've seen it in the fuel sector. The fuel sector, we're promoting localization. We need to see more South African black-owned fuel operators, etc., etc. And very little was happening in the sector for a long period of time, until then a stance was taken from DOE that we're not granting any license if you are not a transforms business. And that was aligning the SAT. Now, very quickly, we had to transform and get that sector fixed. the challenge with that is we are potentially setting up certain business owners for failure because of the speed that you need to transform it. So, a Buhle could be all the right inclinations to own a fuel station, the right funding, etc., etc. But because she has to make a call and a decision in the next couple of months without a necessary transition period between old and new, we need to understand we need to build transformation and businesses on the shoulders of its previous owners, not on the graves of the previous owners.
When I say amen.
So it needs to be driven now, sooner rather than later, because if it's done out of urgency and necessity, then we will struggle with execution and sustainability.
I mean, you touch on, let's say, the policy framework being an enabler, and I think we'll touch on some of those elements coming down. But I think there's a critical point that you also say as drivers, it expands on other things. And maybe I'll come to you, Buhle, to then say there's this element of localized or skills development is also required to ensure that, I think the base of localization can be improved, and it's required, and the skills set. Amith tells us to say we do have the skills. We cannot say that we don't have skills. But I think when you talk about your SETAs, when you talk about all the institutions, how do they play, and how do you see it playing to also be a part of localization in the skills element? When we talk also employment in auto sector.
Yeah. So the reality is, guys, we all know that we have high unemployment rate in South Africa. Sure, when I looked at the numbers, when I was preparing for today, I was shocked. I think it's about 64% of our youth is unemployed currently, about 4.8 million people, kids, young people, 15-year-olds to 24-year-olds. Yeah, I think that's what the stat said. So one time I was asked, actually I had just started as the CFO of Bike. I was asked in a magazine interview, if you were given one day to become a president, what would you do? And because I had this experience of being a restructuring specialist for 7 years at an SOE, I did say that I would introduce business classes or entrepreneurship classes early on in our education system. This thing happened maybe, let's say, a few years ago. But last week, Saturday, I was sitting listening to a panel at a women's event, since we're coming out of August, and Sistemi, who's the principal of a TVET college in Tshwane. I think she's the principal for the TVET college in Tshwane branch. She said they are busy integrating entrepreneurship courses within their syllabuses because they are tired of creating youth that is just educated for jobs, but rather let's create a youth and support and make sure that we capacitate our youth to be able to run businesses. And it's so funny because running a business, even as a BDO employee, I'm heading up a division. I'm actually running that business. But you must remember, we were always taught, okay, you're just there to be somebody's employee. This is what you need to do. So we need to be able to ensure that that skills development is there. As Amith said, guys, we do have the best engineers, the best qualified people, mechanics, everybody. We've got them, but what we need to do is to capacitate them, give them the opportunities to actually showcase what they're capable of. And I was so happy to hear Ustemi on Saturday talk about this specific topic around making sure that the colleges, the SETAs are supporting these college students, if I can put them, or qualified students, to make sure that they understand that it's also their responsibility to empower themselves to be able to get into environments like the auto sector. I remember days where all you could do was become a teacher, a nurse, a medical doctor. Nowadays, there's a lot that you could do, especially with AI coming up. This thing of saying embracing AI is no joke, guys. Walala wasala. As part and parcel of that skills development, I think it's important to also empower yourself. Go for that 6 months course on AI, cybersecurity, advanced technologies. Because the reality is there has to be something different that we're doing to be able to keep up with what Amith said. Now the North of Africa is trying to overtake us. And we know very well in South Africa, we still need vehicles. We don't have the best, yes, as much as there's huge improvement in the rail industry, we don't have, I can't remember the last time I was on a train. Unless I'm going to the airport, I'm on the Gautrain train. Right? I've never in Joburg been on a train from my house to maybe to go watch a soccer game at the stadium. No. The trains don't operate optimally. I can't do that. At the same time, some of us can't afford to fly. We've got all these huge, big OEMs that are, creating these vehicles. There's vehicles everywhere, especially in Joburg. So that means that this auto sector is still very much critical and is needed for us to make sure that we're capacitated. So I think the reality is we need to invest in our people. We need to collaborate. And what I liked about what Amith said, that's why I wanted to say AMEC, is because he said aggressively. We're not saying things are not being done. I mean, when I was, restructuring some of the component manufacturers, the receptiveness of the OEMs was so amazing. As much as they would have given them some notification that maybe quality needs to be improved, or you didn't meet my timelines, or they didn't want to go and get these components from overseas. I can bet you. That's why they've got the enterprise supply developments within. And then one thing I've also appreciated about the OEMs is that they don't just do internships, they do apprenticeship. Is that the right English word? Yes. Meaning, you're not just bringing in this youngster that just came out of a TVET college and give them an internship for 6 months to say, okay, this is how we assemble a vehicle. And then you let that person go. Where do you think they're going to work? Actually, their programs are being run so that that person becomes and forms part of this business. Give you the training, but we're also employing. That's how it's going to work. If others can learn that, even other sectors in my mind, if they can learn that progress that the other OEMs have done, we'll go far in South Africa.
I did say earlier, and probably a sidebar with Buhle before the meeting, as previously the CFO of Bike, wink wink to those who know, and trade secrets which we have not spilled here. But I think what's important for us is quite true, and you touch on let's say these technological advancements and adoption of 4IR, if we can so put it, or AI. And Amith, maybe it's a broad question. Before I come into, let's say, more the policy nuances, let's probably from an AITF perspective, the adoption of these technological advancements and some of these regulations that come at I know that you deal a lot also, probably as a bank, as a partner to the industry, with some of the regulations that come in, like your CBAM that comes in. And there's a topic also that, or a conversation that says, as you technologically advance in an entity, what happens to labor? And it's a pity we don't have a labor rep here. What do you think this balance is in terms of technological advancement, labor, and the skills that is required to take the sector going forward?
When it comes to technology, I think we have to be very cognizant of the fact that it is a differentiator. Now, advanced production efficiencies is something that's key and critical. We all pretty concerned about cost lines. We're all pretty concerned about production efficiencies. We know there's an upgrading manufacturing capability and this is there, but our production efficiencies is low. I think we've been about 68% for the last decade or so, which talks to less quantifiable of our year. So we're struggling with production efficiency. How do we get more efficient? Is with the adoption of this 4R advanced machinery technology. How do we make better use of that? So I feel something. I don't think it's any longer a question of can we, should we, must we. I think it's now a license to trade. And again, you make mention of CBAM. I don't want to start on a CBAM conversation because we'll be here for a long period of time. But we're now being confined to regulations in this regard. So, if we don't adopt cleaner manufacturing principles and production efficiencies, we are going to be taxed for it. We, in essence, going to be fined for it. We're going to lose competitiveness on our production if we don't meet that CBAM regulations. And we need that advanced machinery, technology, AI to take us there. But that creates a lot of uncertainty on employment, considering the points that were made earlier on about high levels of unemployment. But I think what's important to understand is that the replacement of human intervention is not the goal of advanced machinery and AI. It's working alongside that, as opposed to, pushing that technology forward. How do we work alongside technology to advance the current progress? How does that transition look? I remember many moons ago, I was a cashier at one of our chain stores in the school. And we had to take our tills and we had to take to someone at the end of the day base to count every van cent note by manual. And if you're out by 5 cents, by gosh, you better run back downstairs to find your 5 cents, because you are going to be in trouble for, not balancing at the end of the day. And the person who was doing this job was a very, very tedious job. They had to cash up all our cashiers, etc., etc. Now this is done electronically. By the end of the day, you need to have X amount in your till. That's done in a couple of minutes. Everything's done electronically. Now, while you might not need that person in the cashier's office, they can be reallocated to stock in the shelf to ensure that the fresh produce is the right quality, to ensure that everyone is treated adequately, So that resource could be allocated something that is more value adding, as opposed to key and corner and critical. Do you necessarily need someone in a room to count rands and cents? If you can also, and I'm using this as a very sort of practical, and I know it's a rudimental example, but how do we better utilize that resource? So the adoption of AI and the adoption of advanced machinery, I don't necessarily see it as a replacing of human intervention. I think we need to work alongside that to the betterment of the sector and industry. We shouldn't necessarily be threatened by machinery. I think what often happens is the fear and intimidation of machinery, our human nature, is to push it that back. And by doing that, we're no longer working alongside it. At the end of the day, this has to happen. It's not a case of if, must, we should. It has to happen. If we don't jump on it now, Buhle said,
maybe an add-on or a follow-up on that to say, what does it do for localization? What does that technological advancement do? Because I think what I'm hearing you say is that even regulations for argument's sake, like CBA, you can view it as detrimental to the organization, or you can view it as an opportunity to then say, actually, if I change my processes internally, machinery that is required, because of the CBAM regulation coming into play, it then unlocks this technological advancement to some extent. And so how does, am I hearing you say the same thing?
100%. I'm going to use one of your members, which is subsequently also one of our clients, as an example. Melbourne engineer. Don't mistake for Melbourne. As Australia, Melbourne, they hear. They get very offended when you call it the wrong name. And they made the transition from grey steel to green steel, which was thought forward. Are they necessarily seeing the benefits now of it? Probably not. But they would in the next 2 to 3 years. Why were they early adopters of changing their machinery, navigating this green steel journey, etc., etc.? It was key and critical for them to differentiate themselves in future, to remain competitive. Yes, they are now meeting carbon regulations. They are now ticking all these sort of boxes. But for Melbourne Engineering, it wasn't about ticking boxes. It was how to be future-proof, how to differentiate themselves on the larger global scale and create a differentiator that every competitor will take some time to catch up with. And inadvertently, that's what they did. Did it come with pain? Yeah. Did it come with cost? Absolutely no doubt about it. Do they now meet all necessary regulatory requirements? Yes, they do. Are they head and shoulders above their competitors? Yes, they are. Have they already seen a ramp up of business as a result of making this transition from green steel into grey steel, from grey into green? Yes, they have. Now, let's also be totally real about this. We all want to adopt new machinery, new practices, comply to CBAM. Let's be real, folks. As much as we want to save Nemo and the ocean and the ozone, but commercially it makes sense. We stand in it to make money, or alternatively, lose everything. And I think that's a critical juncture that we find ourselves at. It's no longer a nice to have. We can create it or use it as a differentiator, or we're going to cease to exist on a larger scale.
Yeah, look, I think Amith is spot on, working alongside technology and AI. But the biggest thing as a restructuring specialist, I always tell my clients just to find a gap where you can actually utilize technology. It doesn't mean you're going to replace a human being, but what is it that you already, part and parcel of your current processes or your value chain, you know that you've got a huge gap on to be able to be an efficient and effective player in the industry. Find those gaps. Then you can use technology for things that you know very well you do not have. That will also help you with quality and timelines. Because one of the biggest things when it comes to localization I picked up was that if you do not, if VW knows they want to produce Polo Vivos by this time, they won't change it because it's coming from Germany, remember? Yeah. So they won't say, oh, Shem, Buhle Hanise's mat manufacturer is struggling to finish off their products. They don't care. They'll go overseas and get that carpet because when you took your time. So it's important then to utilize technology to take advantage of those gaps that you currently have in your production or in your production process or whatever it is within your ecosystem and your value chain, so that you are more efficient and more effective when you have to produce whatever it is that you're producing or the service that you're offering. That will set you apart. But embracing technology doesn't mean that you replace somebody. Yeah.
Sentle, you spoke about some of the offerings of the AITF, and let's probably stick to this impact of technological advancements to localization. And I would assume to say, as part of beneficiaries, you see a lot of these requests that come through, let's say from a market access perspective, beneficiaries who want to instill some level of technological advancements so that they can be, I think, one, competitive, one, be able to supply into these OEMs. I think it may be true in your in your industry as well, or in your company.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the approach that we have to so technological advancements is that it's more of an enabling input that helps our beneficiaries. Because at the end of the day, sustainability is what you're up in the context of, like I said, global competition. You need to be producing at the top level, or all of on the international market, what's happening in that space. So I think it's definitely something that we are actively pursuing to say, given the changing nature of the value chains, we've spoken about some of the EU requirements on drivetrains are be coming up with the next 30 years. How do we then support businesses now to ensure that they're able to compete in that environment that involves all of these different skills and rapid advancements in technology to ensure that they are just able to compete in the sector. We actually set aside a fund over the next few years that's focusing specifically on these what we call strategic initiatives that are going to support current businesses to transition as required by the market, but also bring in new entrants into the market, because you understand a new part of the value chain is becoming made available, which presents opportunity for, in our case, Black-owned businesses and SMBs to come in and then participate in this value chain. So I think definitely something that we see as an enabler, and for able to use up this word a differentiator in the industry way forward.
I think we've covered this element of the enablers, the localization drive. I think we'll take a 2-3 minute break. When we come back, I think I would like for us now to start talking about the nuances of this policy element of saying what needs to happen. And again, as partners to the industries, to the automotive industry, and particularly component, how do we then ready or better make these component manufacturers to be ready to uptake these opportunities, these gaps? And what does localization also then, how do we drive that forward from a policy element? And what's government role in your thinking as we take it forward? I think, colleagues, let's get to, let's say, wrapping up the conversation. And the wrapping up of the conversation is critical. Let's saying this policy framework needs to be supportive of all the opportunities I think that we've identified. As we said, we are talking about localization. How can localization fuel the sector going forward? Particularly, I think, again, when you look at component manufacturers, where essentially I think we need to have transformation shift in your tier ones, tier twos, and tier threes. And the question is on what is government's role? And for us, it's our line department will be the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition. And we are looking at the policy regime framework at the moment, or the framework at the moment, to say what and how do we then shift the needle. If you consider Thailand, and I think I've made this on many other platforms to say how they've driven their local content or localization drive in their country, is that there are agreements which are made and signed with particular OEMs that are in the country. And by a certain time or 5 years, they need to have reached those targets that have been set. And it then is formulating the incentive structure around that. If you fail to meet the targets, it means you have to pay those back. But there are rigid and robust measures that they've put in play. In a South African context, where to from here?
Yeah, thanks. I think the partnership between government and industry is a critical one to be able to drive the setup forward. And I think about it across sort of 4 Ps. The one is on policy and centered frameworks. The one is on skills and technology adoption. The third is around infrastructure and so market development. How do you achieve that? And then, of course, the fourth is around monitoring management. Because, of course, if you can't monitor something and you're not able to assess how you're doing it, tracking and so on. Policy, I think it's critical for government to leverage existing policy that is in place. As an example, Psalm 2035 provides a good map around how the industry is to grow. Notwithstanding the fact that there's review and so on that is currently in process, it creates a centralized point for the industry to come together, to work together, to drive initiatives to get to the outcomes that we want to achieve. As of this year, the AITF has been appointed as the Secretariat of the Executive Oversight Commission, which is a ministerially chaired committee that takes into account stakeholders, including labor, including industry and government, to work together to try and prioritize certain initiatives within the industry. And underneath this EOC structure, there's also a working group where, as a difference to what's been done in the past, we are now having an implementation focus into some of the policy objectives that have been spoken about in the past, right? In this context, government does have a role to play in reviewing current policy that are auto-focused, the likes of APLAP2, to make sure that it's reacted and sort of leads the speed of change that we're seeing in the auto sector. From a participant's perspective, the industry itself, we want to call on sort of OEMs and that, in fact, tier one is also to commit to some of these localization objectives that master plan is providing as guidance over and above what's required from compliance perspective, to really move from just DUT compliance to actually using the frame to become competitive. On skills, of course, evolving value chains, there's a requirement, industry and government together maybe to partner with to develop, curriculum in some instances to meet the needs of the sector at the moment. I think if you go around sort of the Tibet colleges, you'll find these curriculums that feed into the automotive sector. You find maybe out of date, so maybe there's a little bit more coordination that can be done between Element and the private sector to ensure that the learners that are coming through the system are being trained on the latest technologies, the latest production methods, etc. Which will develop things like R&D labs for new technologies and so on. one of the most mentioned elements about skills training and bringing people into the sector is just around awareness. I think if you have to go to any high school to ask kids, okay, what do you want to be? Those that talk about the automotive sector might say they want to be BMW or Mercedes or Ford. And you don't hear people talking about component manufacturing and what is actually required to get into that space. So there's an element of awareness that I think between government and the private sector, we too actually will be quite proactive in getting that message out. And of course, Buhle has mentioned quite a few things around the skills development and the importance of that in building this sector. Around infrastructure and market development, which also is key because now you're creating all of the things around the production process that will make the sector profitable and successful. There's a big requirement to look at how do we develop things like supplier parks that are capacitated to meet the needs of autos. How do we get involved in projects that are looking to address some of the infrastructural challenges countries are having on rail, road, port, etc. I think those are key enabling interventions that are going to make the sector quite resilient. And then also from market development perspective, how do we then look around getting involved regionally, developing the value chains that we have to stretch reasonably to benefit from minerals, for instance, in our neighboring countries to expand those value chains so that you're also expanding our market at the same time. So those are the kind of interventions that I think are quite critical that government and agencies can work together on. The last one, of course, is monitoring and evaluation, which I think the structure of the EOC, which has brought what used to be quite signed implementation approach into a centralized structure, will help us be able to track on time what has happened in the sector, and where there's need for different interventions, we can then do so as more to be sure that we achieve the ambitions of the master plan that we developed.
No, I think I love how I think you've broken it down, and I'll probably cover that. I think where we sit, colleagues, as I take our closing comments from each of you, is an industry from, let's say, a production level. We are struggling to go above that 600,000 units in terms of productions of the OEMs which are in the country. When you consider the sales of, or the sales market, or where they sell the vehicles into, that has now switched more to an import type of vehicles in the car park that we see, as opposed to traditional. And what that comes with, again, to your policy conversation that you had, and some of the review thinkings that we need to take forward, is how do we change that landscape of saying the market is now 2/3 import in terms of sale versus the local production. And I think some of the nuances that came out of the NAACAM show were to say that I think we need to expand that local OEM business. And I think you mentioned market and development, regional code. Those are the things that we need to look at as we do the APDP to review and export code, and to say also how do we expand the current OEM business and have markets that we then focus or things sell into. One, EU has been one of our biggest, or is currently one of our biggest markets that we supply into. But I think we need to be diversified enough so that when they now talk about certain tariffs conversations like we've seen with the US, it's not an element of us now being panicked on saying, where are we going to find markets? But this integration of an African free trade continental area, I think, is a key discussion that we would need to make. But the other proponent also is to say there are component manufacturers who not only supply to OEMs, that also have an aftermarket space to say, when we go into a policy review and we're talking about localization and expanding some of those, that needs to also have a focus, because they're also building the scale and the transformation and the base of component manufacturers that are going to be supplying into either industry itself or to the aftermarket as component manufacturers. And again, that talks to skills, that talks to employment. And again, we are then able to sustain the industry. But this shift of 38% to the actual targets of what were the ambitions of the automotive master plan. As I said, we should have been at 48%. Maybe parting shots of saying how and what your feelings are to say. I mean, with all of the conversations, again, that we've had today, what will be in 2 minutes your parting shot in terms of us taking the sector forward? How do we drive localization to fuel the sector and to sustain it going forward? Amith, I've such on your side.
By no means again so about it. I think it's imperative that we work together. We do the unconventional for need and necessity. What do I mean by that? How does AITF work with Nedbank and Nedbank work with AITF? How does I'm going to choose Nedbank? How do banks work together with the various houses? We all have institutional knowledge, information, IP, etc. But how do we leverage all of that to the benefit of the sector? I think in bits and pieces, we're all trying to do our little bit, which is amounting to very little. But how do we put this as a collective effort moving forward to drive the one sort of North Star? Firstly, let's agree on that North Star. I think today's conversation, we amongst us here can agree that supporting localization is imperative to the survival for our auto sector. If that's going to be our North Star, then how do we work together in achieving that? By any means necessary. Not traditional, not untraditional, but by any means necessary. I don't think that we don't necessarily have shortcomings with the brake trust we have in this country. We are, however, affected by many silos, and that silo approach of going at it low. Let's bring our ears back into building arches.
Sure.
Buhle?
Yeah, no, I think the gentlemen have touched on very key important things. And the biggest for me is collaboration. And collaboration comes in different forms. If the banks and the AITF can fund a component manufacturer today, that's also collaboration. NAACAM making sure government is kept, to their promise, that's also collaboration. Partnership, extensions of partnerships are critical. How do we make sure that this sector continues to be one of our biggest sectors to ensure that our economy grows? Now, I'm just a developmental person in general. I just want to make sure that our people are fed, they've got the right health care, they're able to take care of their families. They must still retain those businesses and retain employment. For me, that is the biggest thing. And if we can do that and sit together and hold each other accountable, then I think we are on the right track. And I do believe that the outcomes of the NAACAM show did provide the walk the talk mentality, not just go in there and talk. I think, since you did say that there were one-on-one sessions where people were starting to discuss things. Maybe you've heard of somebody and that day they had got an opportunity to see each other and actually say, okay, this is what I can offer on the table. What is it that you need? What is it that what you're missing in your business? What are the gaps? And that's something that I specialize in. I find plausible solutions for businesses to thrive. For those component manufacturers that I know very well, especially in where you were in Gqeberha, they need that capacity. They need that support. Let's please make sure we open the doors for them to be able to, enhance this business mentality that we want to drive for our youth and our economy as well. Thank you.
Setse?
Yeah, I think, what we can't avoid is that the industry is in a bit of a perfect storm at the moment. We're dealing with, these trade issues with the US, compliance requirements across the EU. We're dealing with a strong competitive push from China on technological changes within the auto sector. And of course, all of this coupled with low economic growth in our local market really does paint a picture that the industry is going through a tough period. That being said, I think it's also important to remember as an industry in South Africa, we're 100 years old, over 100 years old, with, you know, periods of war and other shocks that have happened, and the industry has been able to make it through. All relevant stakeholders, I think, need to look to work together to push through the current or environment that you're operating under. You mentioned around localization needing to have been at 48% by 2025, and I think that's where it starts, right? Everything that is happening globally, well, there's elements that we can do something about, some but we can't. But I think, just to make an example of, simple activities like stamping and, injection molding and all of those things, and those are not necessarily high value activities, but they help to move us closer to that target. While during the time we can focus on these skills and training and R&D developments that will help us participate in more value-adding activities in the value chain. So I think, as a grouping, the sector needs to put together to say, "Oh, let's use what we have to move us to where we want in the future." This is an instance where we have to sort of build the plane while it's already flying. There's no time to there's no time to wait, and there's a need for sort of urgent action.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I think from industry colleagues and NAACAM partners who are key and are principal specialists and who understand the sector and the support that is required to sustain the industry and to drive the policy frameworks that we need, particularly when we zone in on localization. I think the policy framework, I think it's come clear on today's conversation to say it is a key to say we need to have a policy framework or regime that will then take us forward, that will make us competitive when you consider the South African landscape and globally, so that we can be able to compete and change the current dynamics or hailstorms that the panelists or my fellow colleagues here mentioned. I think I also like the phrase of saying localization should not be seen as just for compliance, but as a means of entrenching it into operations. And again, from a policy level to then force those outcomes. And then I think we'll see a tier base that is going to, or supplier base, tier ones, tier two, tier threes that will grow, that will then support all of our local OEMs. And I think this collaboration piece also, again, from government perspective, in saying that they need to play their role in enabling the environment for us as the business or the private business to be able to do what we do best. But they need to create the environment and create that support. There needs to be that working relationship and integration between component manufacturers and the OEMs that we supply into, and some of the developmental and supply development programs that I think the panelists were mentioning today, those need to be far stronger. And then lastly, I think, is to say that the conversations that happened, and let's say the output of what happened at the NAACAM show this year, and what Minister Parkstow, Minister Makosazana Amith, Stella Ndabeni, the DP Paul Mashatile, were all aligned to say we need to grow the market. We need the market to be, or the sector to be supported. And localization is that piece. So as we go into probably more of the APDP2 reviews, I think that's going to be the subject of saying, how do we do it better so that we are more competitive? To my panelists and colleagues, thank you very much for availing yourselves and the time. I think it was a wonderful insights that you brought onto us today, for partnering also at the NAACAM show of 2025. Thank you for showing up, and I think the way that you guys showed up to BDO for all of the three podcasts that we've again wrapping up today. We thank you very much, and all of the support that we've gotten, I think, in the 3 sessions. Plus, we look forward to more of these that we're going to be doing as an industry, and the support that you guys give us. Thank you very much. Till next time.
Take care.